Tonight we're going to try to untangle Greek and Roman mythology, and it's. I was talking to Elizabeth before this, and she had never even asked the question that there was any difference at all between Greek and Roman mythology. Aren't they just Greco-Roman religion? And so we'll see if we can kind of do that, a little bit of that untangling. This is actually a topic that Erjan requested, and he's unfortunately, because of his schedule, not able to be here, but he's, I'm sure, joining us in recording. So, hi, Erjan. So, the gods, I'd say, of Greek and Roman mythology are still with us in our popular culture. These are just a couple sets of the pantheon from a movie called Clash of the Titans in the 80s, and then a remake that they recently made of it, Clash of the Titans. But they're actually gods in all kinds of movies, everything from Roman gods, to the Marvel comics often have, or the DC ones, I guess, are the ones that have interspersed with Roman mythology, right? The Latin and Greek versions, when we have them, are often syncretized. So, for example, this is all the gods from the cartoon Hercules. And so Hercules is the Latin name of Heracles, the Greek hero. So this is the Roman hero Hercules. But Hercules, when he's running around, he's talking not to Jupiter and Saturn, I believe, in the movie, but he's talking to people like Hades and Zeus, which is to say the Greek version. So it's totally intermixed, right? Oh, here it is. Yeah, Hercules, Latin, Heracles, Greek. And so we, in English anyway, may know the god or hero by a Latin name. But even then, we're probably going to know the stories as they're coming from us, or at least the originals from ancient Greek mythology, as opposed to, let's say, if they were originally in Latin mythology, Roman mythology. Another example is we usually say Ulysses, even though the original Greek hero is Odysseus, so Ulysses is the Roman version. And we think of, though, the great Greek epic, the Odyssey, which we use that word. But anyway, we have Ulysses running around in the Odyssey, right? We know that that's probably Odysseus, but anyway, the movies are Ulysses. So sometimes our picture, actually, of these gods comes a little bit more from the Roman side. So there's been a big bump in the amount of that the character or the god Ares gets a lot of play these days. So he's a big character, like in Xena Warrior Princess. He's a big character in the Wonder Woman saga, I guess. And yet Ares, as a god, the Greek god, is of very little importance at all to Greek mythology. He's not anywhere nearly as important. Whereas Mars, the Roman god with whom Ares is associated, actually was a very important god. I'm not saying that this doesn't really look a lot like how we picture Mars, or neither does this, but in any event, the fact that the guy is important is probably more because of Mars than because of Ares. A couple places we definitely have the Roman name and the Roman conceptions. So, for example, our Valentine's Day with the little cupids running around, that's generally speaking Cupid, the Latin god, who is associated with the Greek god Eros. And Eros, though, is not usually depicted as this little cherub kid. It's actually usually a young man. And so we're seeing that as one of the examples where it's more the Roman myth and name that have survived for us. Like I say, often it's just totally mixed. So Hercules, is the son here of the Greek god Zeus, as opposed to making it all one or the other. So usually we use Greek stories, Greek origins, but we have whatever name suits us. Actually, like it says here, like with Disney, we often just make the stories up, so they may not relate too much to the actual original mythology at all.
And the high five.
Yeah, they do a lot of high-fiving in ancient Greece, right? In ancient Rome. All right. So one place where we have all the Latin names, where those predominate for us, is in the planets. And so, obviously, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and even poor Pluto that doesn't get to be a planet anymore, ice dwarfs. And then the biggest of the dwarf planets, the asteroids, are Ceres and Vesta, as opposed to then the associated Greek gods, Hermes, Aphrodite, Ares, Zeus, Kronos, Ouranos. Probably should say this now. I don't know. Anyway, Poseidon, Demeter, Hestia, Hades, right? Okay, so I want to cover a couple things in this presentation. So first, who are the Roman gods? And for me, I always assume when I want to show Roman stuff, it's mosaics, right? As opposed to the Greek gods, which are pots, right? Anyway, so what Greek gods are they all associated with? We kind of went through associations there on the planets of some of the main ones. How did those associations come about? So why do we see here Neptune as equaling Poseidon? So the Roman god Neptune on the left, the Greek god Poseidon. They both got tridents. They're both they both have seahorses, hippocampus. That one doesn't have it on that pot, but he does it on other pots. How do the associations come about? To what extent? So if it is the Roman god totally different from the Greek counterpart and not the same? I want to ask a little bit, step back a little bit and say, well, what is mythology at all anyway? And how, in a way, maybe is that different from, in contemporary religion, modern ideas in, for example, the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam of scripture? How is that different from ancient traditions of telling myths, or is it different? And question, did these Romans actually believe in the gods, or if they believed in the gods, did they actually believe these stories, the myths of them, which sometimes seem pretty outlandish and amazing? And therefore, what role did mythology play in ancient Roman religion? And essentially, by correspondence, how different a role is it, for example, than in contemporary religions and Abrahamic religions, the role of Quran or Torah or the Bible compared to ancient myths? And then also, I'm going to also try to say, so what are some of the historical lenses as we look back now throughout the ages from where we are now in the essentially modern blockbuster action movies through all the different past to get to back in antiquity when the gods were actually revered as actual gods? So how are we distorting, or what are the different lenses that have distorted our picture of the gods today? All right. Rome is a big place, big empire. And so, if we're going to talk about any topic like this, there's going to be a lot of complexity, from how things are practiced from the one end to the other end of the empire. And of course, there's also a huge scope of time. And so it's a time and place. In terms of scope, I'm going to really focus in, on the city of Rome as opposed to a belief or practice, let's say, what the legions are doing on the frontiers of Hadrian's Wall. Likewise, we'll look at particular moments, I think, of the Archaic period, and then also when the myths are kind of getting written down in terms of the timeline. So for this timeline here, I've set up essentially the main timeline of the Western Empire and its predecessors. So the empire, its predecessors, the Roman Republic, and the legendary period of the kings of Rome, that where a kingdom preceded the Roman Republic almost certainly. However, we don't really have actual history of it. We have instead mytho-historic accounts. So essentially a period of time where the Romans tell stories about kings, ancient kings, that seem like their history, but in fact are actually myth-telling of a different kind. So we have from the date of the traditional founding of Rome, 753, to the period of those 7 legendary kings, to their overthrow, the foundation of the Roman Republic. At that time, the major influences of the early Romans, so their neighbors, the Etruscans in the north, and also Campania, and then in southern Italy, the Greeks who have settled down there. The different wars against Pyrrhus first, and then the Carthaginians, that caused Rome to become a great power in the West, and ultimately the biggest power in the Mediterranean by the time of the civil wars and Julius Caesar and the foundation of the empire under Augustus. And that's that time period right around the meridian of time here, when we switch from BCE to CE or from BC to AD. That's also when Augustus is also patronizing these great poets, and also his contemporaries are patronizing Virgil, Ovid, and others who are actually the people that are writing these myths down in the literary format that we then really have. So a lot of them have been composed or orally or in earlier sources that are lost to us, and they're all kind of getting through that lens of that Middle Time, through the Roman Empire all the way up till the pagan empire ends with the conversion of Constantine, and ultimately his successor Theodosius, who makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and does things like, for example, shut down the pagan games, the Olympics, the Academy, and all the other pagan temples. And then ultimately then the fall of the Western Empire. Questions on the timeline? Yes. Oh, wait, we need to, can I have to speak into the microphone?
Yes, in there it says the year 285 is division of empire, but conversion of Christianity, you put it in the 4th century.
So there's a early division of the empire, which is just administrative, so the empire is still all one in terms of, it's like, let's say, one state, but it has 2 capitals. And so under the Emperor Diocletian, at the end of an unrest period of time called the crisis of the 3rd century, the first strong emperor in a very long time, Diocletian, decides it's impossible for one emperor and one capital to essentially manage this entire state properly with all of the different frontiers and all of the different things. So essentially, you have this frontier that the Germans are always pushing against, and you have this frontier that the Persians are always pushing against. And so what Diocletian does is he divides the empire, and there's essentially a capital that's here at Milan, and there's a base that's here at Trier, and then there's a capital that's here at Nicaea, and Diocletian goes here to Spoleto. And so the Eastern Empire then is focused on these frontiers, and the Western Empire on this. Mm-hmm. Then at different times from that division, sometimes that's maintained where there's 2 different capitals, but sometimes one emperor from one side or the other will knock the other one out and just rule the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And so one of those times when an emperor rules the whole thing is the Emperor Constantine. Oh. And so when he does that reunites the empire for a while, but it's later split again. And so it's not always divided, but essentially that's what this should mean here is the first division of the empire. But the division of the empire administratively is actually a completely separate thing from the conversion of the empire to Christianity, which happens later. So the division under Diocletian actually is quite anti-Christian and has some Christian persecutions. So,
but my point is simply that when Constantine, when he made Christianity a state religion, he made it for the entire empire, not just
for the entire empire.
Okay.
You're exactly right. Yes.
Okay.
And so both the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire are Christian. The Western Empire ends technically in 453. The Eastern Empire continues until 1453. So it's like 457 and 1453 it should be, I think. All right. So I think we tend to have like a picture of Rome that's maybe ourselves a composite picture where we kind of see Rome as its kind of late pagan imperial greatness, but we maybe think of it as being Julius Caesar's in charge of it. And so, when Caesar is still there, it's still a lot different, and a lot of those monuments and the size and everything like that, it's administratively and politically quite powerful, but all of this, these later magnificent buildings and everything like that wouldn't have been around in Caesar's time. It's still Augustus who's finding a city that's made of wood and leaving a city that's made of marble, and it's still many emperors afterwards that continue to add to it. But as we kind of zoom in anyway on the traditional center of the city, we have the Capitoline Hill, the Palatine Hill, the Roman Forum, the Campus Martius. It was back the later, in the Middle Ages, this becomes the medieval and Renaissance city, and then across the little bridge here is where the Vatican is, right? And so that's at the outskirts of what would have been the ancient city. So anyway, in the ancient city, as we're kind of looking at it, we kind of zoom in to the Capitoline Hill, which is kind of the center of the Roman state religion. We think of the word capital is derived from the fact that the Capitoline Hill is at the center of what essentially the capital of Rome. And at the top of that here is the temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus. And so that means Jupiter the best and the greatest. So there was an original 6th century temple that was destroyed by fire. It's rebuilt in 69 BCE. There's subsequent rebuildings as well. But the center of the religion here throughout the period in Rome, from the time period of the kings, all through the Republic, all through the pagan part of the empire until Constantine converts to Christianity, in which case Jupiter essentially gets displaced. Although, by the way, his image stays the same. This is pretty much where the image of the Christian God comes from. But in any event, he gets more clothes. But that's where we kind of got it. So anyway, so Jupiter ends up being the head of the Roman religion. And unlike, for example, the Greeks, who have all these different city-states, of which the most prominent that we are aware of, Athens, the main patron there is actually Athena, not the chief of the pantheon. So the chief of the pantheon is Zeus, but their chief god in any particular city-state might be something different. So for the Romans and for their city, really Jupiter. So Jupiter's name, so Latin is the language that the Romans speak. Latin is an Italic language. Italic by way of Proto-Italic, so in other words, an earlier version of the Italic languages descends back to Indo-European languages. And so back in the Proto-Italic, there would have been a word that is like juice, which means sky, and then pater, which means father, and ultimately pater becomes that in Latin as well. And so that becomes then sky father. Yes?
Is it like very similar to Sanskrit?
Yes, it's very similar to Sanskrit is the question.
Because it's like so similar to, like in Sanskrit also, this is how it's pronounced.
So the comment is we have to be able to spread this microphone around, so otherwise people can't hear you.
Yeah, well, if it's a short question or comment, you can repeat it.
So the point of it is that in terms of Sanskrit, which is a related language, because Sanskrit is also an Indo-European language, Sanskrit here is almost the same, therefore, as the Proto-Italic. And the reality is the reason why linguists in the 19th century discovered that Indic languages like Sanskrit are related to languages like Greek and Latin is because they looked at Latin and they looked at Sanskrit and they're like, this is crazy. These line up like nutso, so there must be something going on. And what it turns out is there is a parent language that's lost, of which all of these languages from, what's the current Indian languages is something like Urdu, and anyway, the current Northern Indian languages, Iranian, all the way across to Slavic and Russian, the Romance languages and the German languages. So in other words, those are all related to each other. Not every language in between is, because there's a bunch of languages in there that are their own totally unrelated languages, like Basque, but all these other ones are related, right? So in Latin, then, the genitive of Jupiter, so it's just to say Latin has all these case endings. And so for us, we have a couple of words that are like that in English, like I, me, mine, he, his, him, those kind of words. Latin, all the nouns are like that. And so Jupiter is a third declension noun which begins very irregularly. So Jupiter is the nominative, but all of the others are go like, Jovis, Jove. And so as a result of that, the way we say it, they would say Jovis, Jove, Jupiter. But anyway, so by Jove, if you've heard English people say that, by Jove, I think he's done it. That means you're swearing by Jupiter, because that would be in the ablative. Okay, can I have the slides back? Okay, So if we were to be in that temple on the Capitol, so in the temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, there's in fact three gods that are worshipped there: Jupiter, Minerva, and Juno, or Juno in her form Juno Regina, so the Juno the queen. This is quite normal in a lot of ancient Indo-European religions to have these triads and to create these kind of god trinities. But it is very unusual to have one man and two women. It's usually in these things it will be two men and one woman, or just three men. But in any event, we have two female gods and one male god that are here at the center of the capital in terms of that religion. Roman society, we'll just note, is very, very, very patriarchal. That's one of the Romans' values that they were really excited about. The pater familias of the family, which is to say father of the family, has all sorts of rights over his entire clan. Traditionally, the right of even life or death over wife and sons and daughters, although it's quite bad taste to actually exercise that right, so people wouldn't look highly on you. But in any event, all of those kind of rights within that, and ultimately even to Augustus, when he becomes emperor, what we call emperor. They didn't use that title back then. Emperor didn't mean that yet. When he becomes head of the Roman state, the title that he was most excited to get was Pater Patriae, which means father of the fatherland. So the Romans, again, were one of those places that have a fatherland as opposed to your motherland. So it's not like Mother England. It's Pater, Patria, in terms of the Roman state. So,
birds.
Yeah, well, we'll look at the birds in the future slide. But yes, they each have a bird. But we'll look at them in a bit. Okay, so Jupiter, from the time of the kings, is the head of the pantheon and chief god of the state religion. It becomes a little bit problematic after the period of the kings because he's the king, right? And so he has all the kind of the regalia that he's wearing of the Roman kings. And so throughout the entire Republican period, they have to kind of tone down him being kind of a king because they are really, into not emphasizing kings and thinking that kings are bad. But then again, when the Republic is no longer a thing and there's now emperors that are running it, the emperors are able to be more equated with Jupiter again, and so it isn't as hard for Jupiter to be kind of the head of the pantheon. Like I said, he's then worshipped as part of this trio. So Juno is his wife, and his sister is Minerva. Minerva gets associated with Athena. There's another triad worshipped elsewhere in the early city from the earliest times. Jupiter's also part of this one, but the second one consists of himself, Mars, and this relatively mysterious god Quirinus. There really aren't almost any images of Quirinus, but this is a coin that he kind of appears on. The Romans actually call themselves Quirites, and that's in reference to this kind of god, Quirinus. And so it's thought to be that means men of Quirinus, and that the word probably comes from kind of a compound co-virium, where vir, it means man, and so viri means men. So it's a co-group of men, which is to say a curia, as it comes together, all of these different assemblies that when we did that, we did in a lecture a couple months ago on the Roman Constitution. And so the Senate obviously is one of the most famous bodies that the Romans have, but there's also all these curiae, which is to say all these assemblies, the tribunal assembly, the centuriate assembly, the curial assembly. So where all these curiaes meet, where the Romans are doing different kinds of republic ministerial functions and things like that. So Quirinus then is associated with the city founder Romulus after his death, and that's the only place where we get a sense of what he might, where the thing comes from. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the god always was that, and it's not entirely clear because we have so little about him. But what he does seem to be is kind of this especially municipal or god with the Roman Republic ideas, right? So all of the people in the Republic are Quirites because of Quirinus. All right. So how are we finding out what the oldest parts are? Well, so part of the way we can do it is by looking at the oldest traditions and the oldest institutions within the Roman Republic. These are ones that may well go back to the time period of the kings, and that includes this group called the Flamines, or it's a flamen. Flamines is the plural here. So there are that archaic triad that we just mentioned of Quirinus, Mars, and Jupiter. Each one of them had a major priest, one of the major priests of the Roman state, called a flamen. And so flamen means apparently he who burns offerings, and so it's obviously cognate, as you can imagine, with the word like flame, right? So a flamen. It had to be a patrician, which is to say the people who are the nobles has to be one of these priests, or at least the chief flamens, not the lesser flamens. Jupiter's priest is called the flamen dialis. Mars's priest is the flamen martialis, or martialis, and then Quirinus has one called the quirinalis. So in other words, these are three of the chief priests. The other two major priests in Rome are the Pontifex Maximus, which is to say the head pontiff, which is a title that even the Pope still has, and then the other one being the Rex Sacrorum, which is it's a curious holdover of the title Rex, king, as it goes on into this time period of the Republic where the Republican Romans hate kings, right? So he's the king, but of the Sacrorum, of the sacred things, right? And so he's not a king in terms of being able to do anything except for some of those sacred functions that the kings used to have. But in any event, that's what this Rex Sacrorum used to be. Okay, so just look at one of these so we can kind of see how they work. So the flamen dialis, this is to say the flamen who is the priest, the lead priest for Jupiter, has to be a patrician, which is to say a nobleman. He has to have gotten married by this very sacred sacrament of conferatio, feriato, which is to say the strict marriage. Normally, Romans got married by common law, which is they more or less, you are sleeping together, you're shacked up. You have to hardly say more than that, so people acknowledge the fact that that's happening, and so then you're married. But for this, it's a special ceremony that is much closer to the ceremony that we preserved in the West, where we're doing all of the special things of witnesses, of making sure the bride is a virgin and she's wearing white, and her father is leading her through the whole town and putting her in the hand of the husband, giving her to the new family. And so that's essentially it's like the tradition that we have. Anyway, the origin of our kind of the one in the West. So also very hard to divorce when you go through that, as opposed to the regular common law, which is more or less get out. So anyway, so it's a lot more complicated. So it's the holy marriage, right? So upon consecration, so when the person is made into the flamen is then emancipated from his father. And so we mentioned how Romans are very patriarchal. And so if you're like, let's say my age, my dad's still alive, he's technically, got a lot of power over the whole family still as the leader of the whole clan. But since I'm the flamen dialis, and so I'm specifically devoted here to Jupiter, my dad doesn't got me anymore. I'm just specifically for Jupiter. He has to wear an apex. This is a relief, and you can see kind of this hat that the guy has on with the little pointy thing on the top. So he gets to wear a toga praetexta, which is to say the big fancy Roman toga. He's allowed a lictor. And so if you have ever remember that we have these things, fascism has those fasces, which is to say a bundle of sticks and axes. And so the magistrates of the Roman Republic have all these lictors who walk in front of them to show their authority. Well, in addition to folks like the consul, which is to say the chief executives of the Roman Republic, the flamen here gets a lictor as well. He has a curule seat, so these seats that ultimately evolve into medieval thrones. And he's by right of his office ex officio, he's a member of the Senate. When he's having a banquet, nobody's allowed to sit in a place that's higher than him, except these other two major priests that we mentioned before, the Pontifex Maximus and the Rex Sacrorum. So because he's holy to Jupiter, The rest of us can't be eating higher than him in the place, right? There's a lot of restrictions that go with it, though. So here's a modern reenactor and what they think the hat looks like. So the flamandialis is not allowed to stay outside the city for a single night. So you can go outside the city, but then you got to come back within the sacred boundaries for sleeping time. The guy is not allowed to touch iron. Where did I go? That's more restrictions. I got to go back. Here it is. Okay, he cannot touch iron. He can't get on a horse or even touch a horse. He can't touch dogs, she-goats, ivy, beans, raw flesh, flour, leaven, leavened bread. There's a lot of things you can't touch. So why iron? So iron, Jupiter, as you can imagine, casts electricity so with the lightning. But a lot of these other things, the idea of it is you are being kept apart from like all the things that you'd have to do to be, let's say, a soldier or doing like all kinds of other regular stuff. He's not allowed to visit graves or touch dead bodies. So there's this idea of ritual impurity that the dead are doing that. He can go to funerals, but he can't go see them. He can't go to a graveside burial. He's got to wear the hat, and he's got a whole bunch of other special garments that he has to wear all times. He's not allowed to sleep away from his own bed for 3 nights. So he's in the city, but he has to go back to his own special bed, where his bed is actually the feet of which are smeared with clay, so that it's connected into the earth, and nobody else is allowed to sleep in that bed. It's just him. If he's going to get a haircut, you can't have a slave do it. Only a free man can cut the hair. And then you take the leftover hair and any nail clippings if you're clipping fingernails, and you have to take them and bury them under a special sacred lucky tree. Anyway, because he's paired with a priestess, which is to say that woman that he married in that special, she's also a patrician, and they married in that very special wedding rite. She becomes the Flaminica Dialis. So she is a special priestess then, who also has almost all the same restrictions, not the hat, and has to do all kinds of other kind of religious functions. If she dies, he becomes a widower, he's got to resign. That's it. So they are a paired couple in this kind of administration, and that's true for a lot of these flamines, so these Roman priesthoods. So even though it's a very patriarchal society in terms of the fathers all being in charge, there's nevertheless understood both in the divine and here in the priestly world that there needs to be a pairing of the male and the female, as the female is responsible for certain functions that they have to do, and the priest is responsible for certain functions. Okay. So this is meant to be then a priesthood that it sets you apart from doing daily life stuff, right? You can't bake bread. There's all kinds of things that you're not allowed to do. They're just supposed to serve the god. In fact, the most famous person that would have been chosen to be the flamandialis is actually Julius Caesar when he was a kid or a young man. His father-in-law, Cinna, who had been a lieutenant of Sulla, got the priesthood for him, but they never fully consecrated him for some technical reason that isn't entirely clear, and so he never had the hat on and all that kind of thing. If he had done that, all of history would have been different, because it would have precluded Caesar having any of his later career. He couldn't have been a consul. You're not allowed to be a consul if you're the flamandialis, and certainly he can't even leave the city, much less go and rule Gaul and all that kind of thing that he did, right? So instead, he would have been presiding over the cult of Jupiter. He would have been providing all over all of Jupiter's festivals, all the different sacrifices. So all of that I kind of just set out to kind of illustrate the kind of scope of Roman religion, which is really focused on like a lot of rules and then a lot of different obligations of what you're supposed to do. And that's really at the center of the Roman religion, especially more traditionally going back all the way to archaic times. Another component of that, and this is more about how then the Romans are interacting with the gods. So it's through another kind of priesthood called augury. So since Jupiter is literally sky father, so the father of the sky that is controlling everything from lightning and thunder to the weather, the Romans really believe that Jupiter is continually communicating with them via weather, via especially thunder and lightning. But he's also in control of the sky in general. So what birds are doing in the sky, so are they all taking off and flying one direction? Are they flying together? Are they going different ways? All the different things that might happen, they understand that to be under Jupiter's control and also transmitting messages to them. But you have to have been trained to know what those messages might be, and you have to perform certain rituals and ask certain incantations and questions in order to get the right results from what the augury will be. So the augurs, for example, will do an incantation where they'll ask, si fas est, so just to say, if fas means good in terms of right with God, so as opposed to nefas, which means, against what the God's will is, right? And so if it is fas for you, God, if Jupiter, this is to your will, then give me a sign. I want to have a sign, and that sign will be one of these different things that you're kind of asking for. And then they'll let all the birds loose and see what happens, and you'll watch the birds gone. And that is observed from a platform called an auspice, of which then we have the word auspicious if the birds fly the right way, or inauspicious if they fly the wrong way, in result of that question. So the Romans are in continual communication with their gods in this kind of a way. Okay, so that's kind of just a background of the archaic Roman religion. And now we want to try to get into the mythology here. And we talked about asking this question about syncretism between Jupiter and Zeus. So Jupiter was definitely a Roman god all the way back, and we saw how his name even is a holdover going back to the Indo-European. So what's his connection to the Greek god Zeus? Totally equated today in the Disney animated classic Hercules and so many other movies, but anyway, back then. And actually, in this particular case, they actually have a very historic connection, because they are both actually cognate with each other. And this is not true for most of the Greek and Roman gods, but it is true for Zeus and Jupiter. So we talked about how Latin is derived from Italic languages, that is derived ultimately from this hypothetical source, Indo-European, that also had Sanskrit as its descendant. Likewise, Greek didn't necessarily go through Mycenaean, but Mycenaean is an earlier form of Greek anyway. So Proto-Greek, and this is just a Mycenaean word, also derives from Indo-European. So there is a hypothetical or reconstructed word here, Deus, which is probably close to Sanskrit as well, which means sky. The Mycenaeans, the very earliest name that they have for their chief god or their sky god is Diwe. So that's attested in Linear B inscriptions from the Mycenaeans, which is that time period that's before the Greek Dark Ages, before the Greeks lose literacy, so it's all the way back to there. And then when classical Greece emerges, the name of their god is Zeus, right? And so those, again, are derived ultimately from that Indo-European word. In Italic, it went this way, it became Zeus, and then they added this word pater, which means father, and that's how we get Jupiter, right? So ultimately, therefore, it's the same, probably, god that's going back to the ancient Indo-Europeans. Okay, so although Jupiter and the other gods we mentioned were worshipped by the Romans since their prehistory, the images that we have, though, of them, and also, for example, their attributes, by the time we actually get sculptures and this kind of thing in the later Republic and the Empire, have already been substantially influenced by Greek art. And so Elizabeth had pointed out all these birds, because she's a bird spotter. And so it turns out that Minerva, Juno, and Jupiter all have their own totem bird here. So there's an owl you can see. This is an eagle. Anybody know what that is?
Swan?
Peacock.
Peacock.
Peacock, yep. And so those are the
Eyes.
sacred animals, though, not from any kind of past association with the Roman gods, but with their Greek counterparts, right? So we know, for example, that Athena, we know that is wise, and she's got the owl as her kind of totem, that Zeus has the eagle. The eagle's sent to punish Prometheus, and he's always, it's Zeus's eagle that is eating out his liver. And also, for example, when he's having the affair with Ganymede, he has the eagle come and get the kid, or young man to bring him back. Likewise, with Hera. Hera has her servant, what's his name? Argos? Yeah, Argos, who has all the 100 eyes. And so that becomes the peacock with all of the eyes, on the back of its, at least on decorative feathers, right? It's an ideological myth that explains why peacocks have these decorative eyes on their tail. So what happened here is we're already, this is actually even this helmet. That looks like what the helmet Athena wears, right? So there's some Romanization of what the gods are looking like, but they've been quite taken over from the iconography and also attributes, and just in general, the imagery has been massively influenced by their Greek counterparts as they've been syncretized together, as they've equated Minerva with Athena, Jupiter with Zeus, and Juno with Hera. Okay, so how does that happen? So if we turn all the way back even to Rome at its very beginning, when it's just starting out here, it's founded all the way back here in the 700s as a city-state, but it really only is a little tiny city that doesn't have very much influence. Even here, it's saying here by 500 years, so just within that monarchical period, it's still only just an important city-state that has some surrounding territory. And that's true all the way down here to 400. So even at this early time, then, Rome is simply an important city-state among the other Latin tribes, this kind of pink area. And the Latins are simply one of the Italic tribes. So these are those people that are speaking that Italic language, people like the Samnites and everybody. And then they are then in turn surrounded by these people called the Etruscans, who are also down here a little bit. And, there's Gauls up here who are scaring everybody, or Celts. And then down here, though, Greeks have colonized the whole of southern Italy and Sicily. And indeed, this is where we even get the word Greece. So the Greeks, as you may know, don't call themselves Greeks. But it's when they moved here. This area is called Magna Graecia. When the Romans encounter Greeks, that's the place where they're from. And so because we are kind of descended from the Romans, we use the Roman word for the Greeks. So prior to that expansion, the Greeks are already down there. The Etruscans are up to the north. Although the Romans, have many of their own archaic practices, from the beginning of their history, they're massively influenced by these two more sophisticated, more economically and culturally developed neighbors. Okay, so let's just look at that, in simplified terms here. So we have those native Italic traditions that the Romans pull through in order to create their religion, and some of those things that we talked about of those officials and things like that are part of it. So they're a conservative people. They're descended from those Italic ancestors. They retain a lot of that stuff, and so that's certainly part of the mix of what becomes Roman religion. But there's also, though, this very heavy influence of the Etruscans, who are all around them and more civilized, and they are actually giving all kinds of different ideas and practices to the Romans, including, we talked about that whole thing about augury. The Etruscans are the ones who really make what for the Romans they consider it to be a science. It's a science that the Etruscans make up. And so they're getting that whole component of their religion from the Etruscans. But even with all of that very near at hand influence that the Etruscans have, there's a lot of influences coming from those Greeks that are down there. So Greek city-states are even more influential because they are such cultural innovators. And indeed, one of the things that they're innovating about is celebrating their gods in things like poetry, in sculpture, coming up with inventing things like plays. And especially they're doing things like creating all of this pots for export. The pots are decorated with all of this iconography. Their gods therefore become the infectious pop stars of the day. You might go around to all places like the Romans. They might not have they have the gods, but they don't have a statue of it. They don't have a pot that has the picture of the god. They don't have stories even necessarily about what the god does. You know what the god does. He rumbles. and it tells you whether or not you should go out, what you should do this or that, and you ask the god for these or that favors, but you may not have these elaborate stories of where the god came from, or why the god is that way, or what the god looks like, or any of those things. And so they, when you find somebody who does have that, it's immediately powerful and intriguing, and you maybe think, well, how is that god related to my god, right? One of the things that also is true, even though the Etruscan influence is very close at hand for the Romans, the Greeks are massively influencing the Etruscans. So the Etruscans also have a lot less formulated mythology and things like that before they start to import all of these Greek ideas. And indeed, one of the things that the Etruscans, they're quite rich, but one of the things that they love to do is import all of that Greek pottery. And so there's more Athenian pots in great shape in Tuscany than there is back in Attica, back in Athens, because the Etruscans imported so many of the things. And so there's all kinds of these, and they're all about Greek myths and everything like that, but the Etruscans are understanding those pictures now. They know those stories. They're adapting those stories to their own native Etruscan gods, who in some cases then influence the Roman gods. Okay, so by way then of a simplified overview, the Romans always had their own gods like Jupiter, Minerva, Juno, Quirinus, Mars. But still, when we're back in what I'm calling the mythic period of Rome's history, so that period of the kings, we don't have good history from that time period. We only have actually when the Romans said about it, which is largely a mythical past. The Romans were already back then, though, appropriating, for example, the idea of setting up statues of their gods. They had gods, but now they're going to have a statue of the god, and now they're going to make a house for that god to live in, that god's statue to live in. So temples that are designed on Etruscan models and also on Greek models, they get that from the Etruscans. So the Romans, though, had always had, like the duties they performed, but now from the Greeks, they learn stories about them, and so that's where we're getting here to the mythology, right? So this is the Vestal Virgins in this image, and it's in one of these early temples that are these round temples. There's a couple of those on the Roman Forum that are the more primitive type. Okay, so as the Romans are exposed very, very early on to Greek myths, they start to write their own versions of these stories, and they take Greek heroes and they write new episodes for those heroes that include visiting Rome. And so when you're going back all the way back to the earliest ones of these, it makes very much sense that the ones that they immediately appropriate are the very popular Greek heroes, Heracles and Odysseus, but in part because those are the guys who do all the traveling. So if you know the story of Odysseus, he is trying to get home from the Trojan War. He's on a boat, and he keeps on getting sailing off course, and he has to sail all around the whole Mediterranean in order to make his way back home after 10 years of wandering. And so in so doing, the Romans are able to say, well, he's going by where we are. This is our kind of part of the story. Likewise, Heracles has all of these 12 labors to perform, which sent him all around the world, including going all the way to the edge of the Mediterranean, which is to say where Spain and Morocco come together, an area we still call the Pillars of Hercules. It's because the idea is Heracles goes all the way out there and raises up those pillars. And so in one of his last labors, as he's kind of walking home from the Pillars of Hercules, he's brought back all these cattle that he's stolen. Let's see where we got. One of the things that he has done, so he's stolen all these cattle from Gurin, and that's one of his 12 labors. So when he does that, he goes back, according to the Romans. In the earlier Greek versions, he doesn't go by way of Italy. He goes back by way of Africa or something like that. But now as they're writing themselves into the story, he's hanging out in Italy on the way home to Greece. And so he's at the site of, that's going to be the future site of the city of Rome. Rome doesn't exist yet at this early time with Hercules. Instead, there is a monster that lives there, a guy named Cacus. And the Cacus is living under maybe the Aventine Hill. and he has a big cave, and he steals the cattle from Hercules. So this is also something that goes, all the way back into Sanskrit and the Vedas, which is, that these early Indo-Europeans, they do a lot of cattle rustling. And so some of these early stories are about stealing each other's cattle in order to get honor and that kind of a thing. And that certainly is in the Zoroastrian scriptures too. And so anyway, Cacus then steals some of them. He takes them back to his cave and he puts a huge boulder in front of it. And so you can even see, as the story is going, it's an original story with the Romans, and yet there's already elements here that are similar to the Odysseus story. And so Odysseus, in his wanderings, he meets this giant named Polyphemus, the Cyclops, and he steals a bunch of cattle, and he puts the soldiers into the cave, and so then he blocks it up so they can't get out, right? And so in this case, it's the other way around. So he's in there with the cattle. Hercules rips, there's a bunch of different versions of the story. One of them is he rips the top off the mountain, and then he's in there shooting arrows down and trying to kill Cacus, who is a kind of an elemental god who is throwing out smoke and flames, and depending on what happens in this particular Renaissance portrait, he actually wrestles him ultimately, and Hercules is very strong, and so he squeezes all the blood out of him and his eyes pop out and all these kind of gory Roman details. So it depends on what happens, but in any event, it's happening right there in Rome, and Hercules did it, right? So essentially, as it's these Greeks who traveled, it's easier for the Romans to write them into these myths, right? Generally speaking then, as the Romans co-opt a bunch of this mythology, there's usually a Roman spin on the myth. So even though they say, okay, well, I know you're saying that lightning is being hurled by Zeus, your god Zeus, and thunder as well. We know that in fact it's Jupiter who does that, and so therefore it must mean that Jupiter and Zeus are the same, right? And so as they start doing this kind of syncretizing, where they say, well, you're using that word in Greek, but the name as we know that is Jupiter. So as they start putting it together, they nevertheless then start to accept some of the Greek myths as let's say stories that about Zeus are now stories about Jupiter. Nevertheless, in the Roman retelling, they'll tend to express Roman values instead of the Greek values that they're coming from. So, for example, in the Greek myth, so as these earliest kind of creation story that is taking you from the beginning in Greek cosmology or mythology, when you have chaos, and then you have Gaia, which is to say the earth, and then you have Orianus, which is to say the sky. So that's the very first kind of cosmic forces that exist in kind of the Greek pantheon. So the sky and earth give birth to the first race of gods in the Greek myths, which are the Titans. And the chief of the Titans is Kronos, and then his wife is his sister, Rhea. And so at a certain point, in order to overthrow the father sky, Kronos attacks and castrates him, right? And so causing monsters and Aphrodite and all kinds of people to be, not Aphrodite, monsters in this case, to form during the castration. So because of that history that Kronos had in overthrowing his own father, then later when he's kind of king of the gods, and he and Rhea keep having all of these next generation of god kids who are going to be the Olympians, as their babies, he swallows each one of them, right? And so one by one, he swallows them up inside of him so that they can't grow up to overthrow him. But ultimately what ends up happening is that Rhea gets fed up with this. She has her last Olympian kid, who is Zeus, and she hides him on Crete, and instead gets a big rock, gives that to Kronos, he eats the rock, and so then it allows Zeus to grow up, and he's able to overthrow his father by making his father throw up all his brothers and sisters who come out and become the Olympian gods. There's a question. One sec. Yeah.
Me first? Question: if Zeus was then grows up on Crete before returning to fight his father, does this mean he was raised by Minoans, like the humans?
I don't think yet, because I don't think that we're going to have all these people around. So the Minoans are going to be, a later thing. So this is at the very earliest prehistory in terms of kind of like Greek cosmology. So I'm actually forgetting who he's raised by, but he's raised kind of in secret, and it's only later that Kronos realizes that he's been tricked in the guise, and he's got one kid that's running around out there. But yeah, it is maybe one of the reasons why they're thinking about it is because the Greeks remember the Minoans as being, like an early civilization. And so it could be there's a connection there.
Just a quick comment. This is so similar to one of our mythology story about how Krishna, the god, God Krishna came to the world, where his uncle killed all Krishna's brother and sister, and Krishna was the 8th child. And he was Krishna's mother tricked the uncle and sent him across to another place. And that's how Krishna was saved. And then he grew up, killed his uncle, and became a king.
Yeah,
so
there you go.
It's so similar to that story.
We're going to have to do one on other comparative mythology, because there is this amazing, interesting things across, not only even among related peoples, because Indo-European, all the languages and the groups ultimately do go back to the same thing, but actually there's these also archetypes that recur in all kinds of even unrelated mythic traditions. But certainly within that, that's an interesting connection. Thanks.
Sorry, just one more question. I was going to ask this before. You said Jupiter is a sky god.
Yes.
But isn't in Greek mythology the sky god Uranus, the consort of Gaia?
So the sky itself in Greek mythology is Uranus, right? But then there are gods that have power over the sky, and the gods that have power over the sky are the people that overthrow them, right? And so it's Uranus that's just getting castrated by his son Kronos, and now then Kronos becomes the king of all the gods and is also a sky god. He's not simply the sky.
So it's like Apollo and Helios, effectively.
Like Apollo and Helios is another example. So there's one that is more chthonic, which is to say the kind of the older, more elemental
animistic,
god.
Effectively.
Yeah, exactly, animistic. And then there's one that is way newer and more anthropomorphic, and that's another thing that does tend to happen a lot in all kinds of different polytheistic religions, which is to say, as the god that is the old, let's say, chief of the gods, becomes further and more distant and more universal, like becomes the sky itself, it also, that god seems less connected to you. And so people are less interested in just worshiping that god. They prefer to have, let's say, a little figurine of Zeus or something that they know, then they have a kind of they can picture an image, and it's a lot easier than just the element itself that seems very distant and maybe less personable to you. Yeah, Valerie.
Just kind of a little side comment. Feminist scholars have related the coming of these sky gods as a pan-Indo-European phenomenon to the overthrow and or diminution of the importance of formerly very potent female deities.
Right.
And typically in the origin stories of the sky gods, there's an overthrow of a monstrous female.
Yes.
And that's found, I think, both in European traditions and Indian traditions. So that's kind of sort of anyway. There are theories that the elevation of these patriarchal sky gods came with the coming of the warrior peoples of the Central Asian area.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and actually, we should probably do a whole lecture on, as we look at kind of those archaic, the case anyway for archaic mother goddesses that were maybe displaced, like you say, when this group, this particular patriarchal group, these Indo-Europeans, who maybe had a military technology that allowed them to spread from a pretty little place, and somewhere in kind of Ukraine or somewhere where they're from, and actually take over enough places that their language has now spread all the way from India to, here, of course, So anyway, but like you say, in a lot of cases, displacing maybe, there's lots of, especially in the Greek tradition, to my awareness, also in India, where there's a lot of good evidence for mother goddess worship that it displaces.
And they're diminished to mere consorts.
Right. And so it's hard to know in the Roman context. The Romans are so patriarchal all the way back, and so we don't have the myths for it. So it's hard. They certainly have paired, like we say. So the Flamen and the Flaminica. So in other words, there's these god and goddesses are having paired functions anyway, going all the way back in the Roman tradition. Yep.
I've often wondered about the origin of the Romanian word for God. I never got to ask this of my parents, and I've asked other Romanians, but they don't seem to know. The Romanian word for God is Dumnezeu, and Domne means Lord.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, are they actually saying Lord Zeus? And it sounds
Zeo
kind
is
of
what it is? Sounds like
Sounds sort of sacrilegious or heresy to call the God that, but that's what the word is, Dumnezeu.
Yeah, it's interesting that in a lot of cases we talked about this a little bit when we talk about different pagan survivals, where we think, how on earth did Christians in charge of Europe for 1,500 years have pagan names still for planets and days and months and everything like that, and yet even the word God goes back to, it's not like the name of God from Judeo-Christianity or something like that. It's a Anglo-Saxon archaic word that is for a pagan divinity, right, as opposed to a pagan conception of God. So words are very hard to displace. So it could be, I don't really know in that particular case in terms of Romanian. Romanian is descended from Latin, and so the Deo part there is from Deus for Latin, God, or Domina, you're saying. So Dominus, which is Latin for Lord.
And depending on who you ask, Zeus was raised by a nymph or by a goat.
Oh,
but not by humans.
Goat, but not by Minoans. Good, yeah. I'm glad you looked that up. Thank you. Okay, so even though we have that kind of like bloody overthrow, this kind of thing where son struggling against father, that's a very Greek tragic kind of story. Romans are like, that's not our values, as far as Romans are concerned. Romans are about filial piety, so the son is supposed to be very obedient to his father and is being raised, and he's going to be the next one. And so as opposed to this kind of series of bloody overthrows that happens in the Greeks, Orianos to Kronos to Zeus, instead, from Uranus to Saturn to Jupiter, it's a much more kind of orderly thing where the one is kind of going into retirement and the next person has, kind of been elevated because it's his time to be the paterfamilias of all of the gods. And so, for example, as opposed to Kronos, who is almost kind of very monstrous and as a child devourer, same thing like the Krishna's uncle, I presume, who's also not a great figure, who's probably revered by too many people. Saturn, nevertheless, the Roman version of Kronos, so Saturn being Jupiter's dad, he just has a nice retirement. He's got his own temple there in Rome. You can go and worship Saturn, continue to do that even though he's not the chief of the gods anymore. And he's in charge of, a bunch of, it's even thought of as being kind of like a golden age, where, I don't know, in the retirement home, you're going to go over and help out with Saturn, So, okay, there's other ones of these. So Mars, I mentioned, as opposed to Ares. Ares had probably been, more or less a minor god who figures into the story of Aphrodite and her husband Hephaestus. So Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and her powerful but not attractive husband Hephaestus, who is the lame blacksmith of the gods. So he has all of this power, as you could imagine, in kind of this time period of the Iron Age, where being able to smith is, incredibly important to everybody's war capacity. Nevertheless, the goddess of love is not excited about her ugly husband, so has this affair with a minor war god, Ares, primarily in the story as a way to kind of humiliate Hephaestus. It's a bit different when that gets translated and equated with the Roman god Mars, because they understood Mars, because Mars is a war god, to be the same as Ares. Nevertheless, he's a so much more important god to the Romans than Ares ever was to the Greeks, that they changed the story around a little bit. So Mars had always been kind of Rome's principal gods. We saw that he was part of that triad. In addition to his martial function, which we even get that word from him, right? So warfare, Mars. He also is a guardian of agriculture, so he has a month named after him, March, and there's all kinds of festivals. March was the archaic times, the original New Year's, and so it also can be associated with things like the world is going to be renewed again, so we're going to have spring and things are will eventually be planted again. So in other words, an agricultural god in addition to being a god of war. And so when this is a Roman painting from Pompeii of Mars and Venus. The romance between Mars and Venus, they don't really go around emphasizing the affair aspect of it or the scandal aspect of it, and sometimes it even seems like they're just like a married couple, even though, in fact, Venus is married to Vulcan, the Roman version of Hephaestus. Any event, one of the things that comes together for the Romans is that the two of them are parents not through each other, but anyway, by their different spouses. Venus is the mother of Aeneas, who, as we know, is one of the legendary founders of Rome from Virgil's Aeneid. And Mars is, in fact, the father of Romulus and Remus. And so essentially these two, even though they are not producing the Rome's founder together, but between them they produce alternate founders who eventually the lines come together to make the ancestors of the Romans, right? So Venus and Mars, the union of love and war, important to the Romans in that way. So one of the things that's interesting, though, to the extent to which all of these stories that we have, all of the kind of myth stories, even if they've been respun by the Romans or extra episodes have been written in so the Romans are part of them, if they didn't align their god with any Greek god, so they weren't able to find, like a god who seemed to line up with Quirinus. So Quirinus is this important god, but there isn't this, let's say, god of, the Greeks somehow didn't come up with a god of democracy or of let's say, municipal offices or something like that, which is what they would have wanted for Quirinus, and so the Romans never anyway decided on any particular Greek god to equate him with. And as a result of that, Quirinus never really got any imagery, and he never really got any stories. And so that's the reason why, even though he's this important god, that we don't know very much about him, because nothing's written down. There's no Greek stories to pull. So, the only things we really have is, and in as much as he's associated with the deified Romulus, so after Romulus dies and becomes a god, and he maybe is Quirinus, we have the stories that the Romans tell about Romulus, which, although are written as if they're like history, are in fact myths. And he's sometimes equated with the Roman god Janus, and in those cases we have images of him. So, we wanted to talk about this theme, did the Romans believe in their mythology? So, unlike the way we think of religion today, religion in the last, anyway, since Christianity, especially since Paul, the idea that religion is about beliefs and about faith, that you have to believe in God and you have to maybe believe in doctrine, in the Christian case, or in the Judeo and Islamic case, you have to believe that there are certain holy laws that need to be interpreted. The idea in all three of those religions that you have to believe in the kind of sacred authority of your individual scripture. So all of those things are kind of a lot about belief, and so belief has become a major component of religion. Belief wasn't really on the list of things that ancients were called upon to do. They wouldn't say, really stand up and swear their testimony that they believe in Jupiter or any such thing. That's really not the goal of what they did. They also what they were more concerned about were all of those rules and rituals and practices and everything that they are supposed to do in order to at least not be out of favor with the gods, if possible to be in favor with the gods, and in some cases to consult the gods about what's the best course of action to do and what's going to result in a success or bad, or what's a good day and to have a market maybe what's a bad day to have a market, all those kind of consultations that they could do through their augury. And so they definitely had all kinds of ritual behaviors and things that they were called upon to do out of duty and that sort of thing, but it wasn't so much focused on what do you believe about any of those things. I would also say, when we're talking about like believing in myths, did that thing actually happen? Ancient people didn't have at all our modern sensibility about historicity. So because of the development of the modern academic discipline of history, we are so much more aware of the question, what is the most likely scenario about what happened in the past? And we have so many more tools to kind of discern that. So I can tell you things like, no historian thinks that Romulus, the stories about Romulus and Remus with the she-wolf and things like that, there's any chance that that's historical, that those are mythic. That's based on our capacity to do that kind of academic history. They had nothing really like that. What they had in terms of the invention of history in antiquity, part of the things that this kind of skeptical age of the Greeks did was to more or less take kind of a tradition of taking the more fabulous elements, talking animals, this kind of thing, kind of purge that from the kind of mythic stories and make gods into people and make it so that things that are less supernatural and more realistic. And so essentially ancient historians went through a process often of cleaning myths up, but generally saying that they were largely using them kind of uncritically as source material. That's certainly what Herodotus did as the kind of father of the invention of history. So generally speaking, I would just say, is that ancient people, they weren't even ancient historians, they're mostly all just ancient people. They hear these kind of myths, they more or less understand that that happened the way the story is being told. So it probably did happen that Zeus was raised by either a goat or a nymph we know it's Crete. Somebody was there doing it. Maybe it was both the goat and the nymph at different times, or something like that. So in other words, the details they might not be clear on, and it doesn't necessarily matter. They would understand that there's flexibility in terms of how you would tell or retell the story, but the general essentials probably did happen, is what most people would probably think. Again, not with any kind of precision. Another thing that they would have had for all of these kind of myths is they would have had much more currency. And so this little urn here, is in the form of kind of an early Italic hut. And there was an archaic or old hut that was at the foot of the Palatine Hill that was traditionally understood to be the hut of Romulus, and it would occasionally burn down. They'd have to rebuild it and things like that. But the idea of it was meant to have gone all the way back. And the hut is actually at the beginning of a feature that are called the Steps of Cacus. And we've already heard, of Cacus, that story where Hercules fights Cacus, right? And so in a lot of cases, people's myths are actually explaining things that are happening in their daily life. So you don't believe in Romulus? I've been to his hut, So you've seen the hut that he made. What's not to believe in? Same thing, Cacus. There's the steps from Cacus. Any one of these kinds of festivals, any one of these gods, they're all stories are played out in all of the different festivals and rituals and everything that that plays out in your life. As you go around, all of these things are written into the kind of sacred geography of everything that's around you. So in general, they're not sitting around questioning all of these things the way, let's say, we would in our kind of modern way. So one of the examples that we went into kind of at length when we did our story of the Aeneid is this example of what these myths are for, and I'm calling them also sacred stories. These are stories that aren't about discovering what happened in the past, but they are meant to instead explain our identity as a people, or for example, in this case, the Romans telling it, the Roman identity and the Roman character through telling these stories. And so one of them here is the story of one of the founders, Aeneas, who flees Troy, and he always comes with these figurines like this. So Aeneas is a hero, and he carries his old dad, who's lame, on his back, and he has his little son in his hand, and his wife is following behind him, and she gets left behind. And it's because it's showing here as Rome's founders that they're worried about the patriarchal lineage, right? So this filial piety thing. Aeneas, his epithet is, I'm pious Aeneas. I am pious in the original sense of piety, filial piety. I'm pious to my father. And his little son, Iulus or Ascanius, comes with him, right? So they're descended from that. He flees. He brings his household gods from Troy to him. So this is to Italy. And so this is the Romans, again, writing themselves into Greek myths. So the person who formulates that, when we read, when we did the Aeneid, this is a late iteration of a historic understanding. The Romans had this idea before, but they didn't get it written down in this full form until the time of the Roman Empire. So Virgil, who is this great poet of the early imperial period, he has all these important material that is very fortunate. So the primary Greek sacred story included villains who were portrayed as noble, worthy adversaries, the Trojans. So it's not like the Trojans were just stupid or immoral or something like that. They are actually portrayed as quite honorable, and they're actually played up to be really great adversaries in order, so the Greek heroes are much better, that they actually beat somebody worth beating up, right? And so as a result, it's no big deal to be descended from Trojans because they also were really good. They're just fated to lose. One of their number, Aeneas, was fated in the Iliad to found a city, and the Romans claimed to be that city for many centuries prior to when this got written down. Julius Caesar, who had been the adopted father of Augustus, who is the patron of Virgil, he had associated himself with Aeneas in his lifetime, and indeed he thought of himself as being descended from Venus, so Aeneas is Venus's son, and they changed the name of of Aeneas's son, Ascanius, in Latin to Iulus, or it's just to say the ancestor of Julius, right? So the Julian clan. So that way it's fit right here into the imperial dynasty. Virgil's patron, Augustus, promoted himself as the pious son, avenging his adopted father's murder. The whole reason why Augustus or Octavian, he didn't want to have to take over the whole empire and have a civil war and kill everybody, but he had to do it to avenge his father's murder by the senatorial party, right? And so it was a defensive move on his part, and it was expressing piety, is what he wants to show, right? And so that's the same as Aeneas saving his father from Troy. So building on all those details, Virgil then integrated fully Rome into that Greek sacred story. So what does it show? So how does this work in terms of identity formation? So by making this narrative, the hero shows that attention to patriarchal family. He has this mantra, I'm pious Aeneas. It shows what illustrates want to have as their core value. He sails all around the Mediterranean, where he's the ancestor of Romulus and Remus. And by claiming that Trojan descent, the Romans are tied into the Iliad, that sacred story of the Greeks, without having to ever claim that they're subordinate to the Greeks. They don't want to have that. They want to be Greek, but they don't want to be Greek. They don't like the Greeks, but they want to appropriate all of their culture. So it's a big, wonderful move that Virgil is able to make for the Romans. And so anyway, here's a coin of Caesar, and you can see it has here bringing the household gods and bringing the father on his back. So Aeneas and Anchises, his father. Okay, so I'm just going to suggest here, so do they believe, just going back to that question, do they believe these things happen? Virgil, to some extent, knows that he's writing this great epic. He's filling in a lot of details that he's not getting from anywhere other than if he himself maybe is thinking direct revelation from God, but certainly not from any source that he's finding. So he's not simply doing history or anything like that. There's all kinds of stuff that is frankly creative, original detail that's coming from Virgil, right? So the focus in writing that then is not historical. And so although it's not historical, ahistorical, Aeneas' story is still revealing truths at least about how the Romans saw themselves at the time the text was written, right? So at Virgil's time, what we're really seeing is what do the Romans want to believe about themselves as opposed to what their actual history is, right? And that's just what myths do all around. There are loads more of these kind of Roman myths. The most original Roman myths it turns out, actually are from their kind of mythic past, as they are telling the stories leading up to the founding of Rome, these stories of Romulus and Remus being abandoned and raised by the wolves, the she-wolves, ultimately the stories, the legendary stories of the different 7 kings and all of their backgrounds, the overthrow of the last king, the establishment of the Republic, and then later all kinds of things. Some of these stories continue to have impact for us. So there's this kind of legend/myth of Cincinnatus, who they find plowing in the fields in the Republican times. They need him to go win a war, so they appoint him to be dictator. And like a good Republican Roman, he goes, he has complete power over the state, he leads an army, he raises the army, he crushes the foe, and then as soon as that's over, he relinquishes the power of the extraordinary magistrate, so he's no longer a dictator, and he goes back to plowing in his field. And indeed, that Cincinnatus story inspired George Washington and some of the founders of the United States, and which is why they named the city Cincinnati, Ohio, after that. And so some of these kind of reverberate, but again, these are not really historic incidents, and I'm not even sure always who Cincinnatus is maybe off fighting, because that's really not the point. The point is to show what Romans of the Republican era understood to be kind of the core values, not taking power unto oneself except for in an extreme emergency, and then remembering that the state is what counts, and you go back to what you do as a private individual, which is agriculture. So there's plenty of those kind of things, the rape of the Sabine women, all of those things that are part of the Roman mythic and legendary past. So in terms of how, whether people believe those who are writing those, we have a little bit of insight into what the poets think from Virgil's younger contemporary, Ovid, who is in fact actually probably the most important formulator of Roman mythology. So Ovid wrote several long works, including one called the Fasti, which is an arrangement of explaining all of the Roman calendar and all the different things you're supposed to do for all the different gods on all those times, telling stories about the gods. And then more importantly, there is a book called the Metamorphoses, which is the most famous work of Greco-Roman, or at least Roman mythology, where lots and lots of these stories that we otherwise wouldn't have are formulated in the form that come down to us from Ovid. And so Ovid, to explain himself and where he's getting these details, says, I will sing facts, and he's calling them, but some will call them fiction and think no gods appear to mortal men. So there are skeptics in Ovid's day. None of the gods are making appearance. But he says, but there is a God inside us. His movement makes us glow. His power owns the seeds of sacred thought. So we are all evidence that God exists according to, anyway, Ovid's understanding of how the universe works. And so his power owns the seeds of sacred thought. So in other words, you are able to receive inspiration, ideas, and revelation from this God. For me, above all, it's lawful to see a God's face, since I'm a poet, or sing sacred themes. And so, in other words, it's the job of a poet to open yourself up to God's creative revelation or inspiration, as far as Ovid is saying, and probably other poets have a similar idea. So Virgil maybe doesn't quite make this formulation or confession, but this is maybe where they're understanding themselves to be allowed to do all kinds of creative improvisation, because the muses are inspiring them, right? The gods are inspiring them in their understanding. So, from all of that, what I'll just say, from artists like Ovid. So Ovid is not a priest when he's writing all of these things. He's an artist who is telling these stories and reformulating them in poetic works of art. And from there, actually, as they're transmitted through the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, when they continue to inspire all of this artwork and all of these new plays and all of these new kind of stories through the Romantic era, which does more of the same, and ultimately now to our blockbuster video that we have in movies. I would say that that's how Greek and Roman gods, their conflation, their mythology, and their stories have been transmitted and developed and come down to us to this day. And that's my take for untangling the two of them. So. question. Yeah, Jane.
Who were the two beautiful ladies in the romantic picture?
Oh, well, this is...
Do we know the artist?
Whoopsie. So this is not ladies. This is Narcissus. So he's a beautiful young man, and this is Echo. And so this is a story that is really told in the Metamorphoses, so by Ovid. And so essentially there's a very vain, beautiful young man who, anyway, is only interested in looking at his own reflection. There's a nymph, Echo, that's in love with him. But ultimately he, anyway, can't stop looking at his reflection, and he stays there and ultimately, becomes this flower it's an etiological myth for the transformation into where this particular flower, the Narcissus, come from. Whereas Echo, she fades away. She originally could only repeat what he said, and so he'll say something and she'll say, there'll be like a bunch of double entendre where, it was the last few words of his thing will be, I love you, or something like that, and so she can say that. But ultimately, that's how she transforms to just the echo in the air, right? So when you say something out, you hear it back. And so, etiological myths of transformation from Ovid.
And the painting?
I don't know who the painter is. I should have looked that up. I'm sorry. It's pretty, though. I like it.
Yes.
One of the pre-Raphaelites, I think.
Pre-Raphaelites. That's what we're thinking.
Yes, I noticed Echo looks quite beautiful there.
Yeah.
And I was thinking back to that coin you showed, of Caesar's coin, which had Venus on it. It's quite unattractive, that coin with the depiction of Venus. I wonder why.
It was this one, you mean?
No, further back.
Corinus?
There.
Oh, Venus. Oh, yeah.
It looks like death.
Yeah.
That looks born.
Yeah.
Is that Venus?
Yeah, because there's a little Cupid, right? So maybe they just, it's not a very attractive Venus. No. You can only do so much with a coin. So. I kind of filibustered all of you. Do you have a question or from online?
So when the Roman Empire, when the Greco-Roman society replaced all these myths with the stories that come from the Hebrew Bible.
Yep.
So what happened to all this? People just decided, okay, we're not going to pay attention to this anymore, or people continued to, even in Christian times, to think about all those things and even perhaps trying to make sense of, this thing that happened in the Bible is this thing that happened in this ancient story. So,
in so many ways, so much of this stuff is so rooted in Greek and Latin culture. So we'll just look at the Latin side. So much of this, even though Christianity totally displaces the preceding religion, like all kinds of there's all kinds of remnants remain. So one of them is in terms of, like, for example, all the planets. And so as people still are using those features, and the things that are associated with them. So the astrology remains the same, and so if Venus has a certain aspect, the planet Venus, because of its being associated with the female and with the goddess of love, will have different qualities. And so in other words, there's too much that it's tied up with the it's not scientific, but the physical universe's understanding that can't all be shunted away, or isn't all shunted away. There's too much also of the literary footprint that survives. And so, for example, when the Christians decide that they're taking over, some Christians argue we just need to get rid of all of these pagan classics. But the leading Christians actually say no, we need them in order to understand Latin and teach Latin. So the curriculum for people who learned, for scholars throughout time, continued to be the classics. And so they would continue to read all of those, and that's why they're copied. That's why they all survive. And so any of these things, all of these books wouldn't survive if medieval monks hadn't who are Christians, hadn't copied them all, from Latin and kept them in their monasteries and things like that. So I would say that in terms of the common people's religion, what ends up happening is that the Orthodox Christian leaders who are talking to the common people equate the different pagan gods with demons. And so they will go and they will have a local shrine. They'll go and the monks will go and chop down the holy tree that had belonged to whatever god that had been there. And instead of having a holy tree there, then they'll put like a saint statue there or something like that. And so the old ladies that would used to come to get their, they'd lost something and they needed to pray about it, they used to go to the tree. Now there's no tree there, but now Saint Sebastian has a statue there. They still go there. They still get the keys found or whatever they're missing, and it works kind of the same way. So in that sense, that a lot of the religious practices remain. In terms of the mythology survives because it's written down in literature. So we lose kind of the oral tradition, but we retain things like Ovid, and it continues to a lesser extent, it's inspire new stories in the Middle Ages, but it opens back out pretty fast into the Renaissance when new stories, new literature continue to be written to this day. So, who's this one?
Very pretty.
Yeah, they're just using all of these ones that are. So there's centaurs, right? I think there's centaurs here, and there's a person who's got maybe a horn, and it's a guy or a woman. Can you tell?
It's a man.
It looks like a man.
Yeah, I can't see a man. So then it's, I don't know, maybe Apollo. And look toward Dionysius. Bacchus. Yes, Karen. We have to get.
It's by John William Waterhouse.
John William Waterhouse is the painter.
Yeah, and he's not a Pre-Raphaelite, although he's often confused with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. His Echo and Narcissus is by John William Waterhouse. He's not a Pre-Raphaelite, although he's often mistaken for that.
Okay.
As part of the Brotherhood, but he's not. He's a romantic realist.
A romantic realist. Very good. Yeah.
And there's a
Something
huge thing on about that painting and all the mythology around it, and it really does go into the mythology.
Neat. Poke done.
Do you know anything about James Joyce's Ulysses and how it resembles the other literature you mentioned?
Yeah, well, I can't. I guess I'm going to have to say not enough. I've read about it in the past, but I don't have it at the top of my head. I have not read James Joyce's Ulysses, so that's something I'd have to go back to you for. So yeah, as I recall, it's quite a big different take. So there's a big divergence, but then because the book is very well known, it colors everything we know since then in the same way that Shakespeare, when Shakespeare writes about different Renaissance kings or Tudor kings, it affects how we view Henry V. We think he had this rambunctious youth with Falstaff, but that's not true. That's just Shakespeare. So in this particular case, I don't know. Do you know, Elizabeth? Okay. Sorry, we'll have to look it up for next time.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is you said quite a while back that Aries, Mars was important, but Aries was not so important. And that I find strange because war gods seem to be quite important in many places, which is understandable. It's my impression is that a lot of these gods are personifications of aspects of human nature.
Yeah.
And there's a very good reason why they believed that war was not so much divine as we would say divine, but it's something out of human control. Once Mars takes over, people can't. You can start a war, you can't stop it easily. The other thing was the way that for certain kinds of Christians, the pagan authors were forbidden, but they gave Virgil a pass.
Yeah. There's some different ones that the Christians decided, they loved him too much, and they decide, oh well, he was kind of a proto-Christian. He would have been a Christian if there had been Christians, that kind of a thing. And so there was a bunch of philosophers, like so Dante. Even this is all the way later. When he writes his great Christian epic, the Divine Comedy, Virgil is his guide, because he thinks so highly of Virgil. So,
yeah, Philip Goss, who was a Christian Brotherhood minister, father of Edmund Goss, he was. That's a long story, but Virgil was okay. But aside from that, the only thing he wanted anybody to read was the Bible.
In terms of on the first point, the idea that the Greeks did have other war gods that were also, so for example, Athena's a war god. And so in addition to a god of wisdom. And so part of the problem for the Romans, though, is that like an important war god, who's a woman, okay, they have one for that too, Minerva. And so they equate her with that, but you can't fit Mars into that. And so the particular combination of things that Mars had going, they equated him, they decided, because there is kind of a chaos war god kind of guy, but he just was less important in that particular case.
And Aphrodite also had war qualities, because she's in the same way that the Romans equated Venus with Aphrodite, the Greeks equated Phoenician Astarte, which was a war goddess with Aphrodite, and which in turn comes from Ishtar in Babylon.
Yeah, we'll have one last, because I think everybody's getting tired.
Yeah, just to add to what you said, but that was true in Sparta, where they had Aphrodite, I cannot pronounce, Aria.
Okay.
And when it came to Athens, they separated the Aphrodite, like being just the goddess of love and war, but removed all the love and sex and fertility, but removed all the warlike aspects from her.
Yeah. So, to dial back right to the beginning when we said, in fact, none of these things are all coming from like one source of unified doctrine or anything like that. And so, even to go between what the Greeks have and what Athens is different from how the Spartans would even be seeing theirs. They've already had to have gone through syncretization in order to bring their ideas back together too. And then also, the syncretization goes further east to when the Greeks are encountering Middle Easterners, right? All right, and so that will conclude, and we'll take it offline, and we will continue to have discussion over snacks here, and we will thank everybody who has joined us in the stream. Thanks again.